My name is Gary Michael Jones, and before I tell you what I found buried in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, you need to understand something fundamental about fear. Real fear isn't the jump scare in a movie, or the spider you find in your bathroom at 3 a.m. Real fear is the kind that rewires your brain. The kind that makes a decorated combat veteran question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. I spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, 3 tours overseas, countless firefights in places so hostile they don't even make it onto most maps. I've seen what human beings are capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. I thought I'd seen the worst this world had to offer. I was catastrophically wrong. Out here in the Smokies, trading desert sand and IED threats for morning mist and black bear warnings, I thought I'd finally found peace. The kind of peace a man earns after serving his country, after watching friends fall, after carrying weight most people can't even imagine. But these mountains, these ancient watching mountains, they were holding secrets that made my war stories feel like children's bedtime tales. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago, and every single night since then, I've woken up drenched in cold sweat, hearing sounds that don't belong in any forest on Earth. It started on an unremarkable Thursday evening in late October, the kind of evening that tricks you into thinking the world is safe and predictable. The sky had turned that peculiar shade of burnished copper that only happens in autumn, when the dying light catches the turning leaves and sets the entire forest ablaze with color. The temperature was dropping fast, that sharp mountain cold that cuts through layers and settles into your bones. Fog was beginning its nightly ritual, creeping up from the valleys in thick, deliberate waves, moving through the hollows like something with intention, like something alive. I was finishing up paperwork at the ranger station near Sugarland's visitor center when the call came through. Dispatch, a woman named Carol who'd been working the desk for 23 years. Her voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something tight and controlled. The way people sound when they're trying not to panic. 2 hikers overdue by nearly 30 hours near Klingman's Dome, she said. Last known position transmitted from a GPS device that had gone silent 12 hours prior. The family had been calling repeatedly. Local news was starting to make inquiries. We needed eyes on the ground before this became a media situation. Now I've handled dozens of missing person cases in my 3 years as a park ranger. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park sees over 12 million visitors annually, and a certain percentage of those people get themselves into trouble. Twisted ankles on rocky trails, dehydration, people wandering off marked paths, chasing that perfect Instagram photo. Hikers who packed 3 pounds of trail mix but forgot to bring a single water bottle, or any semblance of common sense. Most of these cases resolve within hours. Someone finds their way back, or we find them sitting by a creek, embarrassed and dehydrated but alive. Standard operating procedure. Nothing to lose sleep over. But Klingman's Dome is different. At 6,643 feet, it's the highest point in the Great Smokies, the 3rd highest mountain east of the Mississippi River. It's where weather patterns collide, where fog becomes so dense you can't see your hand in front of your face, where cell phone signals go to die, where radio communication becomes spotty at best and completely dead at worst. It's a place where the mountain itself seems to swallow sound, where voices don't carry the way they should, where even experienced outdoorsmen get that primitive instinct that something isn't quite right. The Cherokee people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years before European contact had stories about Klingman's Dome and the surrounding peaks. They called certain areas of the Smokies the place where spirits dwell, and they avoided specific valleys and ridges, especially after dark. I'd always dismissed those stories as folklore, cultural mythology, the kind of tales people tell to explain natural phenomena they don't understand. I don't dismiss them anymore. My supervisor, a gruff former military man named Patterson who'd served in the Army Rangers before transitioning to park service, pulled me aside before I headed out. His face was drawn, older than I'd ever seen it. He told me to check the area thoroughly, but to be back before full dark, and if I found anything unusual, anything at all that didn't fit the standard lost hiker profile, I was to radio in immediately and wait for backup. The way he said it, with that particular emphasis on anything unusual, made something in my gut twist. Patterson wasn't the type to spook easily. He'd seen action in Desert Storm, had decades of experience in these mountains. and I'd never heard him speak with that kind of barely concealed concern. I asked him directly if there was something I should know, some context I was missing. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that passes between veterans, between men who've seen things civilians can't understand, and then he just said, "Keep your eyes open. Jones, these mountains have moods, and right now, something feels off." That should have been my first real warning. I should have paid more attention to that instinct, that whisper of wrongness. But training and procedure override instinct, and I had a job to do. They paired me with Ranger Dale William Flynn, a man in his late 50s who'd spent 32 years in these mountains. Dale was the kind of ranger who could read a trail the way most people read a newspaper, who could tell you what animals had passed through an area, when they'd passed through, what they'd been doing, just from subtle disturbances in the undergrowth and the pattern of broken twigs. He could identify bird calls I couldn't even hear, could navigate through fog so thick it felt solid, could sense weather changes hours before they arrived. If you were going into difficult terrain in uncertain conditions, Dale Flynn was exactly who you wanted beside you. We loaded our gear into one of the park service trucks, a rugged four-wheel drive Ford that had seen better days but was mechanically sound. Dale checked the equipment twice, his standard protocol, making sure we had extra batteries for the flashlights, emergency supplies, first aid kit, rope flares, emergency blankets, and enough provisions for an unexpected overnight stay. He moved with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this countless times, but I noticed his hands lingered on the satellite phone, checking it more carefully than usual, making absolutely certain it was fully charged. He caught me watching and offered a tight smile. "Mountains don't like being searched after dark," he said, his voice carrying that mountain accent, softened vowels and stretched syllables that marked him as a local, born and raised in these hills. I tried to laugh, to break the tension with some joke about overtime pay, but the sound died in my throat. Something about the way he said it felt less like a joke and more like a warning, maybe even a prayer. The road up to Klingman's Dome is a winding, narrow strip of asphalt that climbs steadily through elevation zones, each one bringing a subtle shift in vegetation and temperature. We started in a mixed hardwood forest, oak and maple and hickory still clinging to autumn leaves, then gradually transitioned into the spruce fir forest that dominates the highest elevations. Trees that look like they belong in Canada rather than Tennessee. The pavement was slick with moisture, and the higher we climbed, the worse visibility became. The mist that had been thin and almost picturesque at lower elevations thickened into proper fog, the kind that presses against the windows and turns headlight beams into useless, diffused glows. Soon the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel deteriorated into rutted, muddy tracks that made the truck bounce and slide. The forest around us had gone completely silent. No birds calling their evening songs, no insects buzzing in the underbrush, no rustle of small animals moving through the fallen leaves. Just the labored grinding of the truck's engine, the splash and crunch of tires fighting for traction in the mud, and the faint, persistent hiss of static from my radio. Even that static sounded wrong somehow. Not the normal white noise of empty frequencies, but something with pattern to it, almost like distant voices speaking in a language just outside comprehension. When we finally parked near the trailhead at the Forney Ridge access point, I stepped out of the truck and the mountain hit me like a physical presence. The air was cold, yes, but more than that, it was heavy, laden with moisture and something else I couldn't name. Something that tasted metallic on the tongue and smelled faintly of ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. My boots sank into soil that was too soft, too wet, layered with years of decaying pine needles and organic matter that released a smell of moss and earth and deep old rot when disturbed. The fog moved between the red spruce and Fraser fir trees in slow, deliberate waves, not blown by any wind I could feel, but moving nonetheless, curling around trunks and flowing over the ground like something searching, something with intention. Dale pulled his pack on, adjusted the straps with practiced efficiency, and took a deep breath of that heavy, wrong air. "Let's keep it quiet," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sound carries strange up here, and we don't know what state those hikers might be in if we find them. Don't want to spook anyone." He was right about sound carrying strangely. Even my own breathing seemed too loud, amplified and distorted by the fog. When I shifted my weight, The crunch of pine needles under my boots sounded like thunder, echoing off invisible rocks and trees in ways that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. We started hiking along the narrow trail that cuts through Forney Ridge, heading toward the last known GPS coordinates, transmitted by the missing hiker's device. The path was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual trail, marked by occasional faded blazes on tree trunks and subtle wear patterns in the undergrowth. The fog clung to us, soaking into our clothes, condensing on exposed skin, making everything damp and clammy and uncomfortable. I checked my GPS unit, a reliable Garmin device that had never failed me before, and watched as the screen flickered once, twice, then displayed my position with what seemed like unusual hesitancy, the dot representing my location jumping slightly as if uncertain. The battery indicator showed full charge, but something about the way the screen kept flickering made me uneasy. I tapped it, checked the settings. Everything appeared normal, but that nagging sense of wrongness persisted. My radio, clipped to my shoulder strap, emitted a soft crackle of static, and I tried adjusting the frequency, scrolling through channels. Nothing but white noise on every single one, not even the faint carrier tone that usually indicates active transmission somewhere in range. We were in a dead zone, cut off from the outside world, alone on this mountain with only each other and whatever was waiting in that fog. We'd been hiking for maybe 40 minutes when the smell hit us. It wasn't the clean, crisp smell of mountain air, or even the normal earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp wood. This was something else entirely. Something that made my Marine Corps training kick in with visceral intensity. It smelled like smoke, but not campfire smoke, something sharper, more chemical, mixed with an underlying note of decay, of meat left too long in the heat, of copper and rust and wrongness. Dale caught it too. I saw his nostrils flare, watched his hand unconsciously move toward the bear spray canister on his belt. Neither of us said anything, but we both slowed our pace, moved more carefully, scanning the fog-shrouded trees with new intensity. The trail widened slightly as we approached the clearing, where the hikers had supposedly made camp. A small, relatively flat area tucked beneath towering spruce and fir, the kind of spot that seems sheltered and safe during daylight, but feels entirely different when fog turns everything beyond 10 feet into an impenetrable wall of gray. Nothing. The campsite stopped us both in our tracks. It was wrong from the first glance, wrong in ways that made my scalp prickle and that old combat alertness snap into place, every sense suddenly razor sharp. 2 tents stood upright, their fabric pristine and undamaged, properly staked and secured as if the occupants had just stepped away for a moment. The campfire ring contained ashes, and when Dale crouched beside it and held his hand over the remains, he looked up at me with eyes that had gone hard and wary. "Still warm," he said quietly. "They were here within the last few hours, maybe less. But everything else told a different story." 2 metal camping mugs sat beside the fire ring, one tipped over with rainwater pooled inside, the other standing upright, still containing what looked like coffee, the surface filmed over but not yet grown cold. A pair of expensive carbon fiber hiking poles leaned against a fallen log, their grip still clean, straps adjusted to someone's specific arm length. A backpack sat open near one of the tents, contents partially spilled, a phone charger coiled beside it, a paperback book face down as if someone had set it aside mid-chapter, intending to return. These weren't the signs of people who'd packed up and hiked out. These were the signs of people interrupted, people who'd stood up from their campfire and walked away from everything they owned, leaving behind phones and wallets and identification and supplies and thousands of dollars worth of gear. And most disturbing of all, there were no footprints leading away from the site. No broken vegetation indicating passage, no trail marking where they'd gone. The ground around the tents was soft pine duff that should have shown every step clearly, but it was smooth, undisturbed, as if the campers had simply evaporated from where they stood. I lifted my radio to my shoulder, pressed the transmit button, heard the click that should have opened the channel. "Base, this is Ranger Jones, Mobile Unit 7. Do you copy?" Static answered me, thick and heavy, not even the squelch break that indicates someone's receiving. I tried again, adjusting frequency, increasing power output. "Base, this is Mobile Unit 7 at Forney Ridge campsite. We have located the missing person's equipment, but no sign of the individuals." Requesting additional support and possible search coordination, please respond. Nothing. The static seemed to grow louder, more aggressive, almost angry in its intensity. Dale tried his radio with identical results, then pulled out the satellite phone, our emergency backup that should have worked even when everything else failed. The screen lit up, showed full battery and signal strength, but when he tried to place a call, the phone just hung, displaying connecting for endless seconds before timing out with an error message neither of us had seen before. Something about atmospheric interference and signal degradation that didn't make technical sense. We were truly alone now, cut off from any backup or support. Exactly the situation every ranger is trained to avoid. Dale suggested we split up to cover more ground, a decision that violated standard search protocol, but made tactical sense given the urgency and the limited daylight we had left. He would loop north toward the ridgeline, following the contour of the mountain, checking for any sign that the hikers had attempted to climb higher, seeking better cell reception or a vantage point. I would head downslope toward Andrews Bald, a high-elevation meadow where people sometimes went to watch sunsets, following a faint trail that wound through thickets of twisted spruce and rhododendron. We agreed to maintain visual or audible contact as much as possible, to check in every 10 minutes with whistle signals, 3 short blasts to indicate all clear, 1 long blast to signal trouble and rally together. We synchronized our watches, confirmed our planned routes, and I watched Dale's form disappear into the fog within seconds, swallowed so completely it was as if he'd never existed. The deeper I moved into the spruce thicket, the more the world contracted around me. Visibility dropped to maybe 15 feet on a good stretch, sometimes as little as 5 feet, when the fog eddied and thickened. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the gray murk, creating more shadows than illumination, turning every tree trunk into a potential threat, every gap between branches into a hiding place for something watching. The temperature continued to drop, cold enough now that my breath came out in visible clouds, cold enough that my fingers were going numb despite my gloves. Every step made a sound, the crack of twigs, the squelch of wet ground, the whisper of fabric as branches caught my jacket, and each sound felt amplified, broadcast into that terrible silence surrounding me. I called out periodically, cupping my hands around my mouth and shouting, "Hello! Park Ranger, can anyone hear me?" My voice sounded flat, dead, absorbed by the fog and the dense forest rather than echoing the way it should have. No response ever came, just that suffocating quiet and the increasingly oppressive sense that I was being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. About 200 yards into my search pattern, the smell hit me again, that same metallic rot I'd caught traces of at the campsite, but stronger now, concentrated and fresh. It wasn't decay, not exactly. It was sharper than that, more like rusted iron mixed with animal musk. The smell of a predator's den, of something wet and alive and definitely not human. The scent grew stronger with each step I took downslope until I found it, a single hiking boot half sunk in a patch of soft mud beside a small seasonal stream. I crouched down, pulling my flashlight in close, and felt my stomach turn over. The boot belonged to one of the missing campers. I could still see the manufacturer's logo stamped into the leather and could see where it had been tied with a distinctive double knot. But the condition of it made bile rise in my throat. The heel was completely shredded, not worn down through use but torn, ripped by something with enough force to gouge through thick rubber and tear through leather backing. When I picked it up, the weight surprised me, heavy with moisture, and when I turned it over to examine the sole, I saw parallel gouges carved completely through the tread, 4 distinct marks spaced like fingers, like claws, something that had hooked into the bottom of this boot and torn it apart while someone's foot was still inside. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow and deliberate and heavy, crushing through underbrush with a weight that suggested something large, something that didn't care about moving quietly. The rhythm was wrong, irregular, sometimes 2 steps close together, then a pause, then 3 steps, like something experimenting with walking, like something that was still learning how bipedal movement worked. I froze completely, every muscle locked, flashlight clutched in one hand and the destroyed boot in the other, listening with every fiber of my being. The footsteps circled, moving from my left to somewhere ahead and to the right, getting closer. Then farther, then closer again, like whatever was out there was studying me, evaluating me, deciding something. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dale, "Dale, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. Complete and total silence descended, so profound it made my ears ring. Then my radio, which had been silent for over an hour, erupted with sound. Not static this time, but something trying to be a voice, something that had studied human speech and was attempting to mimic it but couldn't quite get the mechanics right. It said my name, Gary, but the syllables were stretched too long. The tone was wrong. Harmonics layered under the primary sound like multiple voices speaking in unison, like something inhuman wearing my name like a costume. Then it repeated Gary again, and this time I could hear breathing underneath it, wet and labored and definitely not human. My finger found the transmit button and I whispered, "Dale, say again. Confirm your position." Knowing even as I said it that whatever was broadcasting wasn't Dale, couldn't be Dale, could never be anything human. The response came as a burst of distorted sound, breathing and static, and something that might have been laughter, or might have been grinding teeth. And then silence, my radio going dead again as if nothing had happened. I spun in a slow circle, flashlight sweeping the fog, seeking any shape, any movement, any explanation for what was happening. The beam caught on something reflective about 30 feet ahead, something wet, glistening on leaves, and I moved toward it before my conscious mind could override the impulse. It was blood, fresh and dark, splattered in a pattern that suggested arterial spray, painting leaves and bark in a radius that spoke of violence and tearing and something dying fast. The blood trail led downslope toward the creek bed, thick drops and smears, and mixed with it were other marks, drag patterns where something heavy had been pulled through the mud, claw marks gouged deep into soft earth, and worst of all, what looked like partial handprints, human-sized but wrong, fingers too long and joints bending in directions that violated anatomy, pressed into the ground with enough force to sink 2 inches into packed soil. The smell was overpowering now, that iron and musk combination so thick I could taste it, coating the back of my throat and making me fight not to gag. The forest had changed, or maybe I was just noticing it now, but the trees seemed closer, more oppressive, trunks pressing in from all sides, branches reaching down like grasping fingers. Every shadow held menace. Every space between trees could be hiding something massive and patient and hungry. That old combat instinct was screaming at me now, the hindbrain threat assessment that had kept me alive in firefights and ambushes, telling me in no uncertain terms that I was being hunted, that I had crossed from searcher to prey, that something in these woods was tracking me with intelligence and intention and malice. I should have turned back. Every shred of training and common sense said retreat, regroup, get to the vehicle. Radio for backup from lower elevation, return with numbers and daylight and proper equipment. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Not when those hikers might still be alive, might be injured and hiding, waiting for rescue that would never come if I abandoned them now. So I kept moving downslope, following that blood trail toward the creek, one hand on my service weapon, thumb releasing the safety strap. Around chambered and ready, because whatever had made those claw marks and torn that boot apart wasn't going to be intimidated by harsh language. The slope dropped sharply, unstable scree and wet leaves that made every step treacherous, and I half slid, half climbed down toward the sound of running water. Walker Camp Prong, a small creek that carved through this section of the mountain, its voice normally cheerful and musical, now sounded harsh and discordant, water moving too fast over rocks, creating sounds that almost resembled speech, almost resembling screaming, if you listened with enough imagination and enough fear. I reached the bottom and crouched behind a fallen spruce, letting my eyes adjust, scanning the creek bed. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any forest on earth, low and wet and heavy, like wood bending under immense weight, like bones cracking, like breathing that was too deep and too slow, like something massive forcing air through passages not designed for respiration. The sound came with rhythm, inhale and exhale, each cycle lasting 5 or 6 seconds, each one accompanied by a wet clicking. And underneath it all another sound, softer, almost human, almost like crying, almost like someone in pain trying very hard to be quiet. I eased around the fallen tree, moving with all the stealth my marine training had instilled, controlling my breathing, placing each foot with care, keeping my silhouette low and broken. The fog parted for just a moment, one of those brief gaps when air currents shifted, and I saw it clearly, saw everything. And that moment burned itself into my brain with such intensity that I know I'll be seeing it every time I close my eyes until the day I die. The creature crouched by the creek, hunched over something that had once been human, feeding with terrible efficiency and disturbing delicacy. It was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall even in its crouched position, built with proportions that violated everything I knew about mammalian anatomy. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, reaching nearly to the ground even with the elbows bent, muscles moving under skin that looked simultaneously furred and bare, as if patches of hair grew in irregular patterns over pale, slick flesh that resembled nothing so much as a hairless dog or a person with advanced alopecia, but stretched over a frame that could never be human. The back was hunched, vertebrae visible through the skin, each one pronounced and somehow wrong. Too many bones or bones in wrong positions, creating a spine that curved in ways that should have been mechanically impossible. But it was the head that truly destroyed my understanding of reality. A skull that seemed caught mid-transformation between human and something else. Elongated but not quite canine, jaw too heavy and underslung, hinged wrong, so that when it opened its mouth I could see too many teeth, flat molars mixed with sharp canines, arranged in rows that made no evolutionary sense. And the eyes, those terrible, impossible eyes that I can still see when I'm trying to sleep. When I'm trying to convince myself it was just an animal, just a bear or a feral person, or mass hallucination brought on by altitude and stress. It had 4 eyes, 2 normal ones positioned where eyes should be, amber-colored and reflecting my flashlight beam with that distinctive eyeshine you see in nocturnal animals. But behind them, slightly offset and smaller, were 2 more eyes, darker, almost black, moving independently of the primary pair, swiveling and focusing with insect-like precision, tracking motion and depth in ways that suggested an intelligence far beyond any animal, suggested something that could see into you, past your surface, reading intention and fear and thoughts you hadn't even formed yet. The creature had been feeding on what remained of one of the missing hikers, though there wasn't enough left to determine gender or age, or really anything human anymore. Just torn cloth and exposed tissue and bones scattered in the creek bed. But when my flashlight beam swept across its back, when the light touched it, the creature stopped mid-motion and went absolutely still. Not the stillness of an animal that's been startled, but the perfect calculated stillness of something that's deciding, something that's weighing options and outcomes with cold intelligence. Slowly, with movements that seemed almost mechanical in their precision, it turned its head, the 4 eyes focusing on me 1 pair at a time, first the upper amber set, then the lower black set, looking at me, through me, into me. We stared at each other across that creek bed, maybe 20 feet of space, and an infinite gulf of biology and evolution separating us. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I was looking at something that should not exist, could not exist within any framework of natural history or zoology, something that broke every rule about how life develops and diversifies and adapts. This wasn't an undiscovered species. This was something else entirely, something that made a mockery of categories like species and genus and kingdom. I don't remember drawing my weapon, but suddenly it was in my hands. A Glock 17 service pistol, loaded with 9mm hollow points, 17 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, suddenly feeling as inadequate as a squirt gun facing down a forest fire. My hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding my system, breath coming in short gasps, every instinct screaming contradictory commands: run, fight, freeze, surrender, pray. The creature rose slowly to its full height, water streaming from its fur or skin or whatever that covering was, rivulets of blood and creek water mixing and pooling at its feet. Standing upright, it was even more massive than I'd thought. Over 8 feet tall, arms reaching past its knees, hands that were definitely hands, with opposable thumbs and defined fingers, but each finger was twice as long as human normal, and tipped with thick, black curved claws that gleamed in my light. The musculature was wrong everywhere, bunched in places that didn't match human or any known animal anatomy, suggesting strength levels that could tear through flesh and bone as easily as I might tear paper. It took 1 step forward, not aggressive, not yet, just a single step, testing, watching, and I found myself stepping back, mirroring its movement without conscious thought. 2 predators in a dance as old as evolution itself, evaluating threat, calculating odds, deciding whether to fight or flee or something in between. Then it did something that dropped the temperature of my blood to below freezing, something so unexpected and intelligent and wrong that it shattered my last remaining hope that this was just some undiscovered animal, some evolutionary remnant hiding in these mountains. It lifted one massive arm and raised it toward its face, mimicking exactly the way I was holding my weapon, matching my posture, copying my stance with precision that could only come from observation and comprehension. Its head tilted, the motion disturbingly human, questioning, curious, and the four eyes tracked my tiny movements. My slight shift in weight, the tremor in my hands, processing information and learning from every micro-expression I couldn't control. It was studying me the same way a biologist might study a new species, clinical and detached, and deeply, profoundly curious. This thing wasn't acting on instinct or hunger or territorial aggression. It was thinking, reasoning, problem-solving, treating this encounter as a scientific opportunity, and that realization was somehow more terrifying than raw violence would have been. My finger tightened on the trigger, every tactical instinct saying center mass. Double tap, create distance, assess and re-engage. Standard active threat response. But I couldn't fire. Something in the way it was looking at me, something in that tilted head and those studying eyes, locked my muscles and froze my reflexes. This wasn't just a monster. This was something aware, something conscious, something that knew it was alive and knew I was alive and was trying to understand the connection between us. Its chest expanded, ribs visible under skin. Breathing in deeply, and then it made a sound that traveled through my bones more than my ears, a vocalization that started as a low rumble and built into something between a growl and a whisper, carrying harmonics and overtones that suggested language structure, suggested meaning, suggested an attempt at communication that my brain refused to process because accepting it meant accepting everything I knew about the world was wrong, and then it blinked and everything fell apart. When the upper pair of eyes closed, the lower pair stayed open, watching, unblinking, and I saw with horrible clarity that the two sets were not just redundant organs. They were separate, independent, suggesting either a mutation so extreme it defied genetics, or something worse, something that implied this creature wasn't a single organism, but somehow multiple entities sharing one body, multiple consciousness inhabiting one flesh, a biological impossibility that was standing 20 feet away, studying me with alien intelligence, an undeniable reality. That was my breaking point. That was the moment when my hindbrain override training and rational thought and conscious control and flooded my system with pure survival panic. I fired, twice, 3 times, muzzle flash lighting the fog like lightning, the sharp crack of gunshots impossibly loud after so much silence, echoing off rocks and trees in overlapping waves that disoriented and deafened. I wasn't aiming carefully, wasn't breathing properly or controlling recoil, just pulling the trigger in rapid succession, seeing impact strike high and right, hitting the creature's shoulder and upper chest, dark blood spraying into the fog, and the sound it made in response. That was the sound of mountains screaming, of the earth itself expressing pain, so deep and resonant, it made my sternum vibrate and my vision blur and my knees want to buckle. The creature didn't fall, didn't even stagger much, just jerked slightly from the impacts, and then exploded into motion, covering the distance between us faster than anything that size should be able to move, going from standing still to full charge in less than a second. I stumbled backward, boots slipping on wet rocks, ankle turning painfully, and then I was falling, going down hard into the shallow creek, icy water shocking my system, pain lancing through my leg as my shin cracked against a submerged stone with enough force to split skin and probably crack bone. I rolled, trying to bring my weapon up, but the creature was there, looming over me, blocking out what little light penetrated the fog, massive and dark and smelling of wet fur and copper blood and something else, something chemical and wrong that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. One hand, those impossibly long fingers tipped with claws that gleamed black and wet, reached down toward my face, moving slowly, almost gently, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to die, that this thing was going to tear me apart the way it had torn apart those hikers, that my last thoughts would be confusion and pain, and the terrible knowledge that monsters are real and hiding in plain sight in these mountains. Then a gunshot cracked from above, a heavier caliber than my Glock, and the creature's head snapped sideways as a round struck it. Not a clean hit, but enough to draw attention and blood. Another shot followed immediately, then a third. Someone firing from the ridge above the creek bed with mechanical precision, controlled pairs aimed at center mass. I heard Dale's voice, raw and panicked in a way I'd never heard before, screaming my name, "Gary! Move now!" The creature turned away from me, orienting toward this new threat, and I used that moment to scramble backward through the water, trying to get my feet under me, trying to create distance. My leg wouldn't support weight properly, something torn or broken in the fall, but adrenaline is a beautiful thing, and I managed to half-crawl, half-pull myself toward the creek bank while Dale kept firing. Methodical shots from what sounded like his personal rifle, a Remington 700 in 30 or 6 that he kept in the truck for emergency situations, exactly like this. The creature stood in the creek bed, water swirling around its legs, steam rising from its body where hot blood mixed with cold creek water, and for a moment it seemed confused, almost uncertain, looking from me to the ridge where Dale was positioned, calculating odds, assessing threats, deciding strategy. Then it made a sound that was absolutely a word. I heard it clearly despite the ringing in my ears from gunfire and my own screaming pulse. It spoke one syllable in a voice that shouldn't have been able to form human phonemes, and the word was no. Simple. Definite, almost disappointed, and then it turned and bolted, not running on two legs but dropping to all fours, moving with liquid grace and terrifying speed, bounding up the far bank and disappearing into the forest in seconds, crashing through underbrush loud enough to hear clearly. And then just like that, silence, as if the mountain had swallowed the sound and refused to give it back. Dale slid down the muddy slope in a barely controlled fall, splashing into the creek beside me, hands grabbing my shoulders, checking for wounds, his face pale and eyes too wide, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part relief and part terror and part something else. Maybe recognition, maybe the look of a man whose worldview just shattered and is trying to process the pieces. "Are you hit? Did it bite you?" Gary talked to me. His voice was shaking, professional control barely holding together, and I realized I was shaking too, my whole body convulsing with adrenaline withdrawal and shock and cold water soaking through my clothes. I managed to tell him I was okay, relatively, leg messed up but functional. No bites, no major arterial bleeding, and he nodded, still scanning the fog, rifle raised and ready, looking for any sign of the creature returning. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds that felt like hours, just breathing hard and listening to the forest and waiting for another attack that didn't come. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to ask, and Dale's response was immediate, automatic. The words coming out too fast, too prepared. "Black bear. Big male, probably over 400 pounds, defending a kill." We were surprised it. Lucky to be alive. But the way he said it, flat and emotionless, not trying to convince me but just reciting a script, told me everything I needed to know. He'd seen this thing before or something like it, and he knew exactly how impossible and real it was. And he'd already made the decision that we were never going to speak honestly about what just happened in this creek bed. We started following the creature's trail, not because we thought it was a good idea, but because the procedure demanded documentation, evidence, and some record of what had occurred. The tracks it left were deep and clear in the soft ground, massive four-toed prints that could have been bare, except for the spacing and the depth and the claw patterns that were all wrong. Prints that showed a gait between quadrupedal and bipedal. Sometimes 4 points of contact, sometimes 2, like it couldn't decide what kind of animal it wanted to be. We followed for maybe a quarter mile, moving slowly, weapons drawn, expecting ambush at every turn. The blood trail was easy to track at first, dark splatters on leaves and bark, thick drops pooling in depressions, evidence of significant bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. But gradually the blood became less frequent, smaller drops, lighter color, as if whatever this thing was could heal faster than should be possible, could clot and seal and keep moving, when any normal animal would have bedded down to recover or simply died from blood loss. The tracks led us deeper into old-growth forest, through areas where the canopy was so dense even in autumn that the ground was carpeted with needles and moss thick enough to muffle sound completely. And then, without any warning or explanation, the tracks just stopped. Not faded away, not obscured by hard ground or rock, but literally stopped mid-stride, one set of prints showing the creature moving at speed, And then nothing. Empty ground, no tracks, no blood, no broken vegetation, nothing to indicate where it had gone. It was as if something had reached down from the sky and plucked the creature out of existence, leaving behind only the memory of its passage and the questions we could never answer. We stood there in the fog and the dying light, two men with weapons and training and experience, staring at impossible absence, and I saw Dale's shoulders sag, watched decades of ranger confidence crumble into something that looked like defeat, or maybe exhaustion, the weariness of a man who's been keeping secrets too long and is tired of the wait. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said quietly, "Whatever you think you saw down there, Jones, whatever story you're building in your head, you need to let it go. Right now, before we radio this in, because if you tell them what really happened, if you use words like creature or unknown species, or anything outside of bear attack, your career is over. They'll question your judgment, mandate psych eval, probably put you on medical leave until you recover from the trauma and start telling the right story. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." I wanted to argue, wanted to demand truth and accountability and honest reporting, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. This wasn't his first time having this conversation, and probably wasn't his first encounter with something unexplainable in these mountains. How many times had he stood in the fog, looking at evidence that defied explanation? And how many times had he filed reports that said bear attack or mountain lion sighting or natural causes, carefully omitting the parts that would make him sound insane? We activated Dale's radio as soon as we climbed back to higher elevation, and miraculously, blissfully, it worked. Clear signal to dispatch, Carol's voice coming through steady and professional. Dale gave the report calm and measured. Bear attack, large male, disturbed at a kill site. Ranger Jones sustained minor injuries, one fatality confirmed. Recommend immediate closure of Klingman's Dome area and wildlife officer consultation. Carol's response was immediate. Copy that, Unit 7. Medical and backup en route. ETA 20 minutes. Secure the scene and await assistance. 20 minutes turned into 40, turned into over an hour. The fog slowing response time and making helicopter evac impossible, but eventually rangers and EMTs arrived, a small convoy of vehicles and personnel descending on that blood-soaked creek bed with lights and equipment and authority. They found the remains of what had been a person, found the destroyed campsite, found physical evidence of violence and death, but they didn't ask hard questions about the claw patterns or the unusual tracks or why a bear would completely consume one victim while leaving another camp untouched. They took photos that would later be corrupted, collected samples that would later be lost in processing, wrote reports that fit the standard template for bear attacks, and by the time we were loading into vehicles for transport down the mountain, the official narrative was already solidified and inflexible. The next thing I clearly remember is fluorescent lights too bright, antiseptic smell too strong, the distinctive sounds of a hospital at night, machines beeping and carts rolling, and distant voices paging doctors to rooms and departments. Blowing Rock Medical Center, a small facility about an hour from the park, where they'd taken me for assessment and treatment. My leg required 47 stitches, a clean laceration that the attending physician said looked unusually regular for a fall injury, like something sharp had opened the skin in a deliberate line. My shoulder was bruised, ribs were bruised, various contusions and abrasions covered my arms and back, but overall, I was remarkably intact given what the report claimed had happened. A nurse came in periodically to check vitals, always asking the same scripted questions about pain levels and mental state, always making notations on a tablet without looking at me, and I got the distinct impression that someone had flagged my file, that staff had been told to observe and report, to watch for signs of instability or delusion, or whatever term they use when a ranger starts talking about monsters in the mountains. The next morning, 2 men visited my hospital room, and they were absolutely not medical staff. They wore suits that cost more than my monthly salary, carried briefcases that probably contained paperwork and NDAs and consequences, and introduced themselves as consultants with the National Park Service Office of Risk Management and Public Safety. They sat down without being invited, opened their briefcases in perfect synchronization, and began talking in that particular bureaucratic tone that makes every word sound like a threat wrapped in courtesy. They said they understood I'd been through a traumatic experience, that bear encounters were always serious, that it was completely normal to have confused memories and adrenaline-distorted perceptions in high-stress situations. They said the official report would reflect a bear attack, single adult male black bear, estimated 400 to 500 pounds, defensive behavior protecting a scavenged carcass. Standard wildlife services protocols would be implemented, including temporary trail closures and increased monitoring. They said this narrative was in everyone's best interest, protecting park reputation, preventing panic, and maintaining public confidence in safety protocols. They said I would be given 2 weeks paid leave to recover, followed by standard fitness for duty evaluation before returning to active status. They said all of this without once asking me what I actually saw, what I actually experienced, what actually happened in that creek bed under the fog. And then, almost as an afterthought, one of them slid a single sheet of paper across the bed table, a statement already typed and formatted, maybe 300 words summarizing my encounter with a defensive black bear, and a signature line at the bottom. "For the record," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "just a formality. I signed it. God help me, I signed it without even reading it thoroughly, because in that moment, in that sterile room with those cold men staring at me with flat bureaucratic eyes, I understood exactly how small and powerless I was, how easily my version of events could be dismissed and discredited, how quickly I could go from decorated veteran and respected ranger to mentally unstable liability, requiring supervision and medication. So I signed their paper, confirmed their narrative, accepted their version of reality, and watched them pack up their briefcases and leave with satisfied expressions. 2 men who'd successfully contained another incident, kept another truth from escaping into public consciousness, maintained another layer of the official story that protects people from knowing what actually lives in these mountains. I spent 2 weeks at home, alone except for mandatory check-in calls from the Park Service Administration, asking about my recovery with questions that felt more like surveillance than concern. I didn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, couldn't close my eyes without seeing those 4 eyes blinking out of sequence, couldn't lie in the dark without hearing that voice, that impossible voice saying no in perfect comprehension of what the word meant. I researched constantly, obsessively, falling into deep internet rabbit holes about cryptids and undiscovered species and government cover-ups, reading reports from other rangers who'd seen things they couldn't explain, testimonies from hikers who'd encountered something in the woods that didn't match any known animal, old Cherokee stories about shadow walkers and those who watch from between that described creatures remarkably similar to what I'd seen. The common thread in all of it was silence, official denial, aggressive discrediting of anyone who spoke too loudly about their experiences, a pattern of institutional suppression that went back decades and probably longer. After my mandatory leave ended, after I passed the fitness for duty evaluation by carefully telling the psychologist exactly what she wanted to hear about processing trauma and accepting official explanations, I went back to work. But I couldn't stay away from Klingman's Dome, couldn't stop myself from requesting assignments in that area, couldn't resist the pull to return to that creek bed and that campsite and those trails where everything I thought I understood about reality had been torn apart. One morning, about 6 weeks after the incident, I drove up to Forney Ridge alone, technically on patrol but really on pilgrimage, needing to see the place again in daylight, needing to confirm that it was real and not some nightmare conjured by stress and imagination. The forest looked completely normal. Birds sang in the canopy, squirrels chittered and rustled through leaves, sunlight filtered through branches and created dappled patterns on the ground. Everything was peaceful and beautiful and perfectly, disappointingly ordinary. But when I hiked down to the creek bed, when I reached the exact spot where I'd fallen and where the creature had stood over me, I found something that stopped my heart and confirmed every fear I'd been nursing. Fresh tracks, massive and unmistakable, pressed deep into soft mud that was still wet from overnight rain. Not old tracks, not weathered or washed out, but fresh, made within the last few hours, maybe the last few minutes. 4-toed prints showing that distinctive gait between 2 legs and 4. And they didn't lead away from the creek. They led uphill, back toward the trail, back toward the campsite, back toward where I'd parked my truck. I followed them, hand on my weapon, breath coming fast and shallow, following those tracks through the forest, and they led me in a wide loop, a circle that encompassed the entire area where Dale and I had searched that night. And then they converged, all coming together at a single point. A small clearing I'd never noticed before, hidden by rhododendron and laurel, and in the center of that clearing was a depression in the ground, like a nest or a bed, large enough for something massive to curl up, surrounded by bones. Not just animal bones, though there were plenty of those, deer and boar and smaller creatures, but other bones too, some that were unmistakably human, femurs and ribs and skulls in various states of decay, arranged in patterns that suggested intention, maybe meaning, maybe the beginning of something like art or worship or communication. I stood at the edge of that clearing, staring at physical evidence of something that shouldn't exist, and I heard it faint and distant, coming from deeper in the forest. That same wet breathing, that same rhythm of inhale and exhale, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was watching me right now, probably had been watching me since I'd parked my truck, letting me find this place, letting me see these bones, letting me understand the truth that no official report would ever acknowledge. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to something ancient and intelligent and utterly alien, something that has been here far longer than human visitors, something that knows these ridges and valleys and caves better than any ranger or hiker ever will. And it's still here, still watching, still hunting, and no amount of official denial will change that fact. I'm sitting now at an overlook near Newfound Gap, watching morning fog burn off the valleys, watching families arrive for another day of vacation and photos and hiking, watching children laugh and run along the observation deck, completely oblivious to what sleeps in the hollows below, what wakes when the sun sets and the tourists return to their hotels, what moves through the fog with intelligence and hunger and curiosity about these soft, vulnerable humans who think they're at the top of the food chain. I still patrol these mountains because it's my job, because someone needs to be here who knows the truth, who can watch for signs and maybe, just maybe, warn people away from areas where the danger is real and present and uninterested in official narratives. But I never go alone anymore. And I never go after dark. And I never ever turn my back to the forest because I know what's watching from between the trees. And I know it remembers me the same way I remember it. People think the Smokies are peaceful, think they're safe because there are trails and signs and ranger stations and cell phone towers on some of the peaks. They're wrong. These mountains are old and deep and full of secrets that predate human civilization, secrets that don't fit into biology textbooks or natural history, secrets that watch from the shadows and wait for opportunities and remember every encounter with perfect, patient clarity. The creature I met in that creek bed wasn't an animal, wasn't a cryptid, wasn't an undiscovered species. It was something else entirely, something that makes me question everything about how we understand life and consciousness and evolution. And it's still out there, somewhere between the trees and the fog and the ancient Cherokee lands that remember when these mountains were called the place where spirits dwell, waiting for the next hiker who wanders too far from marked trails, waiting for the next camper who sets up in the wrong clearing, waiting for the next person who needs to learn what I learned that night, that humans are not alone in these woods, have never been alone in these woods, and some of our neighbors have no intention of revealing themselves to a world that would either try to capture them or refuse to believe they exist.